Hi, I'm Elizabeth with Hamilton Native Outpost. And if you've done a native planting, it's important to be able to identify the seedlings if you want to go out there and analyze, do I have any of the plants coming up? So today's video, we want to share how to identify an Indian grass seedling. We're going to look at some of the big things about it, then we're going to get our good eyes out, as I say, and look at some of the really fine characteristics of this grass. So I have an Indian grass seedling here. We dug this up out of the field here this morning, and you can see it's got the top to the Indian grass seedling. It's developing a root system, which we cut off. But these seedlings are small the first year, and they can be variable sizes, mind you, but they're relative to the final size of the plant, they're small because they're spending the time developing this root system. They say that, and this is an Indian grass, but on some of the other native grasses, they've looked and found that it can have 25 miles of root system under one grass if you stacked all the roots end to end. Well, it takes time to build a 25-mile root system, and so this plant is going to spend its summer here in the first year developing this root system, and it's going to be slow to develop on top. When I say it's slow to develop, that can look like a lot of different things, and a lot of that depends on the weather and the competition, how many weeds are in the field. So this particular seedling is just kind of middle of the road size, maybe a little small for this time of year. Sometimes if there's really good weather and good annual weed control competition and annual competition control, you can actually get seed heads to show up on an Indian grass the first year, but don't count on it. So let's go into the characteristics of this plant. One of the first things that I notice is just the form of the plant. It's a very upright plant. It's not trailing across the ground. It's not laying down. It's standing very upright. Looks a little pokey. And that pokiness, actually, when Indian grass gets bigger, is one of the characteristics I use to pull it apart from the blue stems. Blue stems kind of have a more soft look to the top of the leaves. So I'm noticing the general characters of it. Another general character that I find is kind of the color. It's kind of this blue-green color, not like a grass green color, I would say. And also the purple stems. Purple stems are a really good characteristic on Indian grass. Color is, I do say that color is one of those characteristics that you should pay attention to, but don't use it as your definitive identification characteristic because color will vary sometimes. So use it, but don't count on it being there because it's just not that reliable, especially when you move from, even from plant to plant, you know, this plant versus the one growing just next to it. But if you move between varieties, say Cheyenne Indian grass to Rumsey Indian grass or something like that, you will have color differences between those as well. So here's an Indian grass seedling, same purple stem color, same blue-green color to it. This one's been sitting in water. This other one was a little dry, so he looked a little less like robust, a little more rolled up. He was just in a drought situation. Here's our seedling, and this is what we call a tiller. You might call it like a stem of the grass or something like that. This is what we call a tiller. So there's a tiller here. This is the main tiller. Here's another tiller that's developed on it with these leaves sticking off of it. Here's yet another tiller that is developing. It's very small at this point. And if you look really close, you can see yet another tiller down here that has not, it would not be above the soil yet. It was just about to come above the soil. And then it will develop into a tiller with leaves like all of these others. So they start on the root. They're kind of at the base of where the roots meet the plant, I guess, and then come up. So we've got our tiller. What are we looking at with this tiller? We are looking for the flattened base. So down here towards the base of it, if I put it between my fingers, you know, I can kind of roll it, but it's not like round like a straw. It's more round than some things, mind you. It's not like a pressed piece of paper at all. And I can actually roll this one between my fingers. Some of the flattened stems you can't even roll between your fingers. But that flattened tiller base is a good characteristic. Another characteristic that I pay close attention to is the leaf hairs. So the hairs on the leaf, so here's our leaf blade, we're looking for hairs on that. And to do that, I often get it backlit, where I don't hold it up to the sun, but hold it up to the light. And if you get it just right, you can kind of see hairs sticking off of it or not, depending on the plant you're looking at. And there really are no hairs. I did see one hair on this leaf here, down here at the very base, but there's really, and there are a few scattered hairs on the tiller stem on the sheath, but to speak of, there are no hairs on the leaf blade, as opposed to like some of the blue stems that are quite hairy. So our lack of hairs on this is a really good characteristic to pull it apart from some of the other plants that we would be seeing in even potentially in the same native planting if we had planted, say, big blue stem and Indian grass together. Another characteristic that I'm looking at is this newest leaf, the emergent leaf. This one is fully collared leaf, but this one is not fully poked out, doesn't have what we call that collar right there. So that leaf is rolled, and it's rolled up like, you know, if I stand around and I have a piece of paper in my hands, I roll that up and have a nice tube of paper. That's how these leaves are coming out of this plant. They're, as opposed to, I guess the other option is that they can be folded. So it's like folded in half like a piece of paper, like if you just took and folded a piece of paper in half. So these leaves are rolled, not folded. That's a really good characteristic to pay attention to as well. I've saved for last one of the characteristics that has the funniest word, and that's a ligule. So a ligule on a grass is a good identifying characteristic. Some grasses don't have a ligule. Some grasses have a hairy ligule, some have a membranous ligule. So Indian grass kind of has an interesting ligule. Probably one of the most interesting ligules of any of the grasses, if you find ligules interesting, which I do, but I'm kind of a weird plant person. So let's look at the ligule. So where in the world do I find a ligule on my grass plant? So we've got our tiller here, we've got our leaf blade coming down. If I take this leaf blade here and I pull it away from my tiller, you start to see that, oh, there's more like, kind of looks like leaf blade kind of that was encompassing that tiller, that stem, if you will. And so that is called the sheath. That sheath, where the sheath and the leaf blade meet, so right here where they meet, if I look, follow the leaf blade down on the top side of the leaf, you look right in here for that ligule, and it often helps to pull it apart from the plant just a little bit. So there's my ligule, and I can see it well. The ligule on an Indian grass is quite conspicuous. It is like stiff to the touch, so if I touch this, I can feel it. It's not like it just melts away under my finger. Now, it's not a piece of concrete or anything, so it's not that stiff. Don't be pushing on it really hard and thinking, gosh, I just can't hardly feel that. I mean, it's a little bitty structure. So, but this ligule is stiff. It is conspicuous. I can see it well. Also, you might describe it as being fairly tall, this ligule. When the plant is a little more mature, sometimes I actually describe it as being woody. It's a pretty substantial ligule. Also, Indian grass is famous for its ligule of being rifle-sided. So if you think of, and not all of them do it, and the seedlings probably, you don't see it in them a bunch, but if you think of a gun without a scope on it, and you have the bead up front on the barrel, end of the barrel, and you have the notch back here that you line those up with, this would be the rifle sight. And so it's a V notch in that ligule a lot of times. And that makes for a nice characteristic, but don't count on that being there, but it's kind of fun when you get to see one. One characteristic that I use, especially earlier in the season when the plant is a little smaller, this one's pretty big, we're not going to be able to see it today, but here at the junction of, if you dig the plant up, get your pocket knife out or get a shovel out, however you want to do it, dig that plant up, and you've got your roots down here, of course, you've got your greenery up here, your leaves and all of that, tiller forming. There at that junction, sometimes you can find the seed of the Indian grass. And so you can dig different plants up, and if you know what the Indian grass seed looked like that you planted, then you can come in here and find that seed, and you're like, oh, it's not a BB, it looks like an Indian grass seed, must be an Indian grass plant. So that's a nice characteristic that you can also use, especially earlier on. Let's jump in and look at some lookalikes and just kind of use the characteristics that we have found to tell them apart. I have with me a Brooms Edge or sage-grass plant. The first thing I noticed is that this thing is very, very flat compared to the Indiangrass that I had. Of course, it had a flattened tiller base somewhat, but this is like, I can't roll it between my fingers. It's really flat. I also notice that this leaf, this newly emerging leaf, is folded. It is not flat. So if you look at that, you can see it's folded in half like a sheet of paper. It will expand, and even these other leaves are still fairly folded in half. Now, of course, at some point they unfold, but look like a leaf like you would expect it to. But this characteristic is different than what we saw in the Indiangrass, where that newly emerging leaf comes out rolled. Of course, we can look for the ligule in this grass as well, and it's not going to look anything like the ligule on the Indiangrass. So we can start to pick up other characteristics too. But one thing that when I get my plant identified, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is the Indiangrass and this one is not, even if I don't know what this one is, I can start to use other characteristics as I look out across the field. So I can just, color is a really good one, right? And again, don't count on color, but it's a nice characteristic to use. So we've got the blue-green color with the purple stems of the Indiangrass. Well, there's no purple stem on this Brooms Edge. Now there is kind of a red leaf sheath here of this leaf that has turned brown. So you do get some red and purple colors, they're more of a brown shade almost, to this Brooms Edge. So we're looking for fine details here. That's, I guess, the bigger point is we're looking for fine details to tell these things apart. So the color, the form of the plant, we can kind of start to pick that out as well. Another plant that we can compare and contrast to here so that we can learn how to use these characteristics in a compare and contrast is a foxtail. So this foxtail here of course, it's bigger than the Indiangrass, but it didn't have to be that way. We could have picked out an Indiangrass that was bigger than a foxtail as well. So we can't use that characteristic really. But first thing I noticed is the color difference. And of course, don't use color as your identifying characteristic, but once you get keyed in, sometimes it can be quite useful. But there's no purple stems here on the foxtail. It's also got more of a light green color to it. Then the leaves both come out rolled, so we can't use that characteristic here. The tiller base is also flattened, and I can, roll it in my fingers as well. So it's similar in that regards. But probably the best characteristic here is to look at the ligule. The ligule here on this foxtail, it is not substantial. It is just a fine ligule. It doesn't resist my touch at all. And in fact, it looks kind of hairy. So it's just a whole different critter. So the important thing is not necessarily to be able to identify a foxtail as opposed to any other weed. It's to be able to identify your Indiangrass. But you can see how we're using these characteristics. When we look through these characteristics and we ask ourselves, does it have all of the characteristics of what an Indiangrass should have, we can pull out different weeds that vary from the Indiangrass in different ways, but they're missing one or more of the characteristics that we're looking for in the Indiangrass. Now that we've went through what the seedling looks like here inside, it's time to go to the field and see what the seedlings look like in the field. So we're going to go out with Colt, and we're going to look at a first-year planting of Indiangrass seedlings. This field was treated with an herbicide called Panoramic. So what you'll notice is that there's Indiangrass plants out there, there's a few weeds, but it's really quite bare. And the Panoramic is a herbicide that eliminates a lot of the annual weed competition, and it speeds up an establishment quite a bit when you do use it. But it's not always an option. If you're planting diversity or you simply want to avoid the use of that herbicide, those are both reasons that you wouldn't use it. You'll have a lot more annual weed competition. So that's just to say the planting can look a whole lot different. It can look a whole lot hairier, have ragweeds and crabgrasses and lots of foxtails and those sort of annual weeds that come on really quick. So the concept of the Indian grass identification is the same. Of course, it's way easier to see it when we've eliminated all the annual weed competition. But if you can get out there and dig around hands and knees, get on your hands and knees in a planting that doesn't have the Panoramic on it, you can still identify those Indian grass seedlings. It's just a matter of really looking hard and really getting good at identifying the weeds apart. And it's a lot harder on those plantings where you have to like separate so many plants. You have to look at so many plants to find the Indian grass seedlings that you're looking for. So we'll head out to the field, go out there with Colt and see what we can see, what a first year planting looks like that's been treated with Panoramic of Indian grass.
So this field we're standing in is a first year establishment. This was planted mid-April, and we're now towards the end of June, 1st of July. And so we get a lot of questions. People wanting to look at their field and see if they have stand or not. And we've also got some videos to help you determine if you do have a stand. Check them out if you're interested. But today's video is just more on the identification of Indian grass seedlings. So here in front of me, we've got a fairly bare patch in the field where it's probably shallower soil, some sort of restricting layer. The reason it's bare is the Panoramic has stayed up closer to the soil surface and really got us good weed suppression compared to some of the other patches you see behind me. So it's a good spot to look for your Indian grass. So here's an Indian grass seedling. And you can tell by the very purplish stem, kind of a light bluish purple. Some of your foxtails will get confused with it, be more of a bright purple. It's fairly upright in nature. Now this one growing without much competition around it has two tillers coming out the side. Maybe this is just a leaf here, but this is even a tiller, and that's a tiller coming out the side. This is just a normal healthy looking Indian grass seedling, and purple stems. If you was to pull the leaf down on Indian grass, that collar, or ligule as they call it, will split as it gets older, and it'll make like a rear rifle sight, the V look on an open-sided rifle. That's one of the classic characteristics of Indian grass seedlings. They also, a lot like big blue stem and little blue stem, and even switchgrass, they always have the paler blue-green look to them versus a lot of your annuals that people get it confused with are more of a bright green. And that's just the way they are. These seedlings they're not very big. We've been a little bit short on rainfall this year, but they're not dry. They're not drought stressed. The ground is dry, but don't think your seedlings are suffering. This is where the natives really shine. They're coming on. They're on to a well start. And the size of them, you know, my hand there, that'd probably be, you know, that was 6 inches tall or so. And that's off to a good start. There's some shorter ones here in the picture. You know, that one's just 1.5 inches tall. He's also off to a good start. Don't worry about that. There's really not going to be any competition or anything to deal with here. These are off to a good start. Some plants that you might get confused with the Indian grass. So this one here in the front of the picture, that is an Indian grass seedling. Has that same blue-green colored dark purple, let's say, stem. And you see right there, that's a bright purple stem. And this is actually going to be a foxtail. Crabgrass will look very similar, and this one it could actually be either. I'm not good enough to tell. I work on the plants we want, not the ones we don't. But this here, it will either be a crabgrass or a foxtail. It's very flat stemmed. It's got the bright bluish or bright purple red color versus the dark purple. The leaves on it are kind of a blue-green, the same, so kind of got to watch that. But this is an Indian grass seedling, and this is probably a foxtail crabgrass. This here is the Indian grass here in the front of the picture, and you can tell the purplish stem and the blue-green leaves. Whereas this here in the back of the picture, this is a foxtail or a crabgrass, and you can tell by the redder purple colored, a little brighter color. It also, however, has kind of the blue-green colored leaves to it. It's very flat stemmed. It tillers out very quickly, which is another sign. And it's overall, the plant itself is not as upright. Indian grass is more growing upright and vertical, whereas this is going to more lay down and follow the ground. So as we've looked at these seedlings here, and keep in mind there's a lot of other plants that look similar. I just don't have them here in this field. Depends on your weed control, your geographic location, past uses of your field. But if you look at these videos that we're making and the close-ups of the ones that are the crop, it should give you off to a good start to look and see what you've got in your field. This has been Colt Hamilton with Hamilton Native Outpost, and we're very passionate about native plants and enjoy you taking the time to learn and us be able to share this with you.